In the last decade, we've seen extraordinary progress within Britain in terms of overturning homophobic and transphobic discrimination. Virtually all anti-gay laws have been abolished within the space of a decade. That is surely the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. And we've got rid of laws that date back not just decades, but centuries. The law that was used to prosecute Oscar Wilde in 1895, the Gross Indecency Law, was repealed finally in 2003. King Henry VIII's buggery law, dating back to the 1530s, was finally repealed also in 2003. Plus we've had the repeal of Section 28, the right of same-sex couples to foster and adopt children, an equalisation of the age of consent, an end to the ban on gays and lesbians serving in the armed forces, and of course civil partnerships. So these are really momentous social changes which have all happened in a very, very short space of time. And I think it's a great tribute to the many tens of thousands of LGBT people and their straight friends and allies who've worked together consistently, tirelessly over many, many years to create the groundwork which made politicians feel safe and comfortable about bringing those changes to fruition. It's a great tribute to social activism and to human rights defenders who have taken on governments and eventually persuaded them to change. The value of human rights conferences like this one at Salford is that it brings together people interested and involved in human rights, not only from around Britain but from around the world. And by sharing our experiences, we can learn from each other. We can learn what works, what doesn't. We can adapt and use other people's methods to our own situation instead of reinventing the wheel every time. So it's a great learning experience, a sharing experience, and also I think it gives us all a sense of mutual solidarity and confidence, knowing that there are people all over this country and the world who are working for human rights and that they are winning and succeeding. The main homophobic discrimination that remains is the ban on same-sex civil marriage. We do have civil partnerships for same-sex couples, but that's not equality. That's a separate system, and separate is never equal. We know in South Africa they had a system of apartheid, one law for black people, another for white people. Well, that's sort of what the laws on civil marriage and civil partnerships are. Civil marriages are for heterosexuals only, and civil partnerships are for same-sex couples only. Two wrongs don't make a right. Just as it's wrong for a same-sex couple to be denied the right to a civil marriage in a registry office, so it's equally wrong for an opposite-sex couple to be denied the right to a civil partnership in a registry office. We need in a democracy the law to be equal for everyone, and the division between civil marriage and civil partnerships, the discrimination both against heterosexual and homosexual couples embodied in those two legal frameworks, that is fundamentally flawed and against the democratic principle that we should all be equal before the law. So that has to change, and what I'm very heartened by is the fact that even in the absence of a high-profile campaign, according to a Times poll in the summer of 2009, 61% of the British people believe that same-sex couples should have the right to civil marriage. 61%, nearly two-thirds, believe that civil partnerships are not good enough. The new coalition government is a coming together of two quite different parties with two very different traditions in terms of LGBT human rights. The Liberal Democrats have been historically very strong on gay rights, the Conservatives not. Under David Cameron there have been attempts to make the party more gay-friendly, but in terms of concrete practical policies, the Conservatives have never really offered a clear, comprehensive agenda to remedy the remaining issues of discrimination. But I'm not pessimistic, I am hopeful, because in the course of the general election campaign, as a result of protest against Conservative policy that myself and others organised, they did come out in favour of stronger action against homophobic bullying, and in terms of recognising the rights, the legitimate rights of LGBT refugees fleeing homophobic and transphobic persecution in countries abroad. So those were two commitments we did finally get from the Conservatives, two concrete practical commitments, and I hope that with the influence of the Liberal Democrats in the coalition government, those policies will be delivered on, and we might get movement on some other ones as well. We have a huge body of international human rights law. The two problems are monitoring adherence to it and enforcing it. And on the issue of monitoring, to ascertain where the human rights abuses are taking place, myself and other members of the Green Party came up with the idea of a global human rights index, which would periodically, under the auspices of the United Nations, review every country's stance on a checklist of, we identified about 50 different human rights policies, and then would rank the countries in order of their adherence. The idea is that if countries are ranked very lowly, there may be an incentive for at least some of them to seek to remedy the human rights abuses so that they can rank more highly. So it's a bit about their PR and their image. I think also amongst some countries there's probably a bit of, rivalry and a desire to do better than a neighbouring country or, another country with which they're often equated. The other value of a global human rights index would be to measure countries' human rights records over time. So you could see whether countries were improving their human rights record or whether that record was deteriorating. And that would both alert the United Nations and other international bodies that that country needed closer monitoring and action. I think it probably also might alert some of the governments concerned that they needed to take measures to reverse any deterioration. So it's about, if you like, providing incentives through yardsticks. Establishing yardsticks by which countries can measure their human rights record and then providing them with the moral incentive to try and improve it. Many of the worst human rights abusers are heads of state. They're the ones who are orchestrating torture, disappearances, detention without trial, and so on. And traditionally, under international human rights law, they have been exempt from prosecution as heads of state. They have sovereign immunity. Article 27 of the treaty which established the International Criminal Court does, of course, stipulate that heads of state are not immune from prosecution if they commit grave war crimes or crimes against humanity. However, that does not apply retrospectively prior to the creation of the International Criminal Court. So people who committed terrible crimes as heads of state in the 90s or the 80s are exempt. However, I think the good thing about this International Criminal Court is that it now does establish this benchmark that henceforth at least heads of state and other high government officials who commit heinous crimes against humanity will face prosecution. Then of course we have the problematic issue of how is this going to be enforced? And that is an issue that the International Criminal Court and the international community have not yet resolved, because of course the worst human rights abusers aren't going to walk into the court in The Hague or wherever and hand themselves over. So you have leading international human rights abusers like President Mugabe of Zimbabwe or President al-Bashir of Sudan not facing prosecution, as of course they should, in accordance with international human rights statutes. I think if you're campaigning for human rights, the methods you use need to be consistent with the goals that you're seeking. So if you're defending human rights and seeking to uphold human rights, you certainly cannot abuse human rights to achieve that goal. I've always argued that any kind of protest is legitimate, providing it's non-violent. I think violence is where I draw the line. All my campaigning has been around the principle of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience in the Gandhian and Martin Luther King model. I think that ensures that the focus is clearly on the issues and not on the methods. And I deplore the fact that often there are people who have high ideals but sometimes allow the goal to dictate the methods. I don't think the end goal ever justifies the means.